Of course, everybody welcome. It's um it's just wonderful. It's really wonderful to see so many people here because this is the first ever live existential offerings event. Some of you might be familiar with the Global Existential Summits, but they're pre-recorded, and so it's incredibly exciting to have everybody together here, coming together collectively. And of course, on Zoom, it's not the same as being in the room. I can only imagine how lovely it would be to actually feel each other's presence in a building, or in a space together. But what I do think is nice to realize and just reflect on is that even though right now we're just rectangles on each other's screens, we are real people, and we are all together in this moment, all of us live. And hello also to people who will be watching this in time to come. And so really this is coming together to appreciate and explore and be curious about life, about these big questions of life. And really, yes, just thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking your valuable time and making the effort to be here today. So we've had less people signing on in the last couple of minutes, so I think this might be as good a time as any to introduce the wonderful Chris Cleave, who is the first speaker for these events, of these live events. A wonderful, very, very excited to have Chris as the first speaker, because I really, really am always captivated, and I always have things to take away from when I hear him speak, whether that's just a friendly conversation or one of your presentations. So, Chris, thank you so much. Thank you for this gift that you're about to share with everybody. I'm really, really grateful for that. Um, Chris is a novelist. He is also in his final year of training as in a doctorate in existential counseling and existential philosophy, and he is also a private practice practitioner. But apart from that, Chris, I will invite you to introduce yourself in any way that you'd like to, and I give the floor to you. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for that lovely introduction. I think you introduced me just fine. I don't have anything to add to that. I'm a novelist, a therapist, and in the final year of my doctoral research, which is the thing I'm, hoping to share with you today. Uh, the first thing I want to say as well is thank you so much. Right? Thank you, Natalie, for this amazing forum that you're growing and that invites such a wealth of different voices to talk about stuff that's really close to my heart, and I know it is to yours as well. And I've seen how much work you put into making this happen. So I just want to say thank you for that. I want to say huge thanks to my research supervisor, Professor Simon Duplock, who's been a huge help to me. Just want to publicly acknowledge him. And I really want to say thank you to all of you. Hats off for coming out to an event on a Wednesday evening. I'm really grateful and honored, and I will try to be worth your time. Um, shall I get straight into it? Can you see my screen if I share this? Yeah, all good with this? Yeah, great. Um, so I'm going to talk for an hour. I'm going to present this research project that I've been doing for the last couple of years about people's experiences that were therapeutic for them outside formal psychotherapy. And then I'm going to leave half an hour for your questions. The last time I spoke at one of Natalie's events, one of the questions was really amazing and reminded me that we have bodies, um, which actually changed the direction of my research. So please, like, do ask questions. I find it extremely helpful. That's one of the big reasons why I do this, is to hear back, like, what have I missed? What have I um, seen differently from the way that you see it? Like, this is one of the great things about practicing existential therapy, is that there isn't a rule book, and that it is a sensibility and it is a community. So I really value your questions, so please share them at the end. I want to start with a definition. Uh, Therapia is a really old word from the Greek, like an attendance on. a service to, or a care for. Here's a picture of a huge structure called an Asclepion, and this is the Great Asclepion at Epidaurus, which was built BC, about 400 or 500 years BC. You can see here like a ceremonial area at 3. At 2 here is a dormitory where people would stay and they would dream. And in the morning, people would ask each other about their dreams, and dreams would be interpreted. You can see a hippodrome and a gymnastics track at 5. 6 and 7 are a gymnasium and a library, right? Bibliotherapy was an enormous mode of this ancient healing practice. You can see right down in the bottom right-hand corner of this is an amphitheater, right? Theater, drama, enactment of tragedy, and witnessing the human story was an enormous part of what people came for. To these healing centers. So there were 300 of these, and they were dotted all over what we call the ancient, European classical world. And people would never dream of coming for a psychological cure because this difference between body and mind hadn't been invented yet. So these were holistic cures that people would travel hundreds of miles for. So there was an aspect of pilgrimage to come, and there was a multimodal aspect to the therapy. And so this is an ancient word, and I'm going to invite you, just for the purposes of this hour, to hold in mind an ancient definition. Let's imagine that therapy is this attendance by a person or by a group or by a therapist to the being of that person, right? So let's take this really ancient definition. As a therapist, like the first thing I noticed is that I'm a really small part of someone's therapy. So this picture is inspired by the first role that I had when I was training as a therapist at my local bereavement center in Kingston. So Kingston has 2 excellent facilities. It has a great bereavement center and it has a great spiritualist church, right? And I found out that some of my bereavement clients were using both, right? So they would see me on a Tuesday, and on a Thursday they would go to this spiritualist church and they would be talking in some way with the spirits of their ancestors. And this ended up being a practice that I took really seriously in the therapy. And we would speak about those experiences much as we would speak about dreams. People also had pets. They reported that their pets were extremely important to their integration of what had happened to them in their life. Astrology was a huge thing for lots of people, right? People had lots of different modes of therapy, and I was just a small part of it. And I noticed this amazing thing, that they spend 167 hours and 10 minutes every week not in therapy, and only 50 minutes with me. And I think it's very important for me anyway to really notice that and hold that in my heart all the time. This is where I started getting interested in people's everyday therapeutic experiences. As a researcher, as a student of this stuff, I also noticed that most of the research that informs psychotherapy is about those 50 minutes, and nearly all of existence is about the rest of it. And so I found out this really interesting thing studying as an existential philosopher and practitioner. As an existentialist, you can try to notice existence. It's an important thing to try to notice it. I wondered what that meant, and I've promised to speak here in non-technical terms about existentialism. I've promised not to mention Heidegger once, and I'm not going to, apart from that one time, sorry. But I've tried to boil this down into 2 things that I feel that aren't all of existential practice, but 2 important things. The first thing, you can try to notice ordinary things in extraordinary ways. What does that mean? This is Merleau-Ponty doing exactly that really well. Claudel has a phrase saying that certain blue of the sea is so blue that only blood would be more red. This red is what it is. only by connecting up from its place with other reds about it, from which it forms a constellation. It's a certain node in the woof of the simultaneous and the successive. It's a concretion of visibility. It's not an atom. It's a punctuation in the field of red things, which includes the tiles of rooftops, the flags of gatekeepers and of the revolution, certain terrains near Aix or in Madagascar. This passage goes on. It's really long, actually, and it's so beautiful and so long that it sort of hurts to abridge it. The second thing is that you can try to notice that actually there aren't any ordinary things. Sartre does this in this place here. It's we who set up a relationship between this tree and that bit of sky. It's thanks to us. That star, which has been dead for millennia, that quarter moon, and that dark river are disclosed in the unity of a landscape. But if we turn away from this landscape, it will sink back into its dark permanence, and the earth will remain in its lethargy until another consciousness comes along to awaken it. I really like this because it tells us that things are only ordinary if we decide that they're in an order. Right? Things are only ordinary if we're bored of them. Things are only normal if they're normal for us and we're not seeing them. Right? So this is the attitude that I'd like to come to my research with. And these are some numbers I try to notice as a therapist and as a researcher. It's 360 million years since we left the sea. It's 2,600 years since that great Asclepion was built at Epidaurus. Aristides went there 1,870 years ago and was cured, right, of this thing that was ailing him, which we would now call a psychosomatic illness, which he called not being well, right? And he was finding it difficult to breathe. And they asked him to speak and to write. And through that, he said he was cured. And he says, the people cured in this way can boast about it a little bit, which I really love. So all of this wisdom, all of this evolution of therapy, and this tiny number at the bottom, like 50, basically the number of years I've been out of nappies. Like, it's like, what would I know about therapy, really? And so this is the spirit of this research, right? So I asked people, like, what's therapeutic for you? I'm going to jump straight to what one of my participants said, a fantastic person. They all have pseudonyms that they chose themselves. So this person chose the pseudonym Raina, and they said, it seems to me that the nature of healing is that it's organic and it spreads itself naturally. Everything in nature is healing itself. The nature of life is healing. And in our culture, we want to put it in a separate little box and give it to professionals and, make it a very specialized secret society. I think this is like a real warning to me as a therapist, actually. Right? It's not special what I do. It's not secret. I'm not the person who knows how to do this best. Right? I'm with something that the client knows how to do on their own, and I'm really curious about what that is and how I can be helpful in that process. I made this very small website, and it was astonishing how many people replied and wanted to be participants in this. Right? So this is something that's on people's minds, actually, their own therapeutic experience. I asked, have you had an experience that felt therapeutic, but that didn't happen in therapy? Do you want to talk about it? Out of all of those applications, I recruited an 8-person sample, right? So this is phenomenological research. You can have a really small sample, but you go really deep into that. So my big caveat is that I have a tiny sample here, right? So just like I've only been eating solid food for 50 years, right? I've only spoken at depth with 8 people about this. So take what you want from that, but I'm not the world authority on this, right? I'm what I bring is a curiosity rather than having interviewed 20,000 people. But these were amazing people. I'm going to explain why. I wanted to mirror the demographic of my city. So I've got four women, four men, three people who identified as people of color or mixed heritage, two people who identified as gay and or bisexual, three people who have a mental health diagnosis, one person who identified on the autism spectrum, and a whole set of backgrounds, rich and poor. Why does that matter? Um, because a lot of research in psychotherapy has sampled from what they call a weird demographic. That's white, educated, industrialized, rich, and Democrat, right? For the most part. Um, Quite interesting to have a wider sample, a more inclusive sample, and to see what people say about therapy from outside that background. Um, these are the 8 people I spoke to, and I really commend them to you. And I'll have a lot more to say about these people in future. I'm going to focus on one today. But these are the kinds of experiences that we're talking about. So Peter, whose child was stillborn at full term, what he found very therapeutic was going to football matches and screaming with the crowd when the crowd screamed for joy or for sorrow. Right? It was the only place where there was a way for that emotion to be expressed in the world. There just were not words for it. He also found music really helpful, playing music with other people, first in a quartet, then in an orchestra. Right? It was about other people holding that space as an emotional space that he could use. Rhiannon, um, a very busy mother, right? Lost sight of what she needed in the clamor of having kids around and put their needs first. And it was a huge step for her just to take a weekend away to a silent retreat. Right? This wasn't someone who said, right, I'm going to go away and live in a monastery for a year. A measure of how stressful her life was that it was hard just to take a weekend away. And in that silence, actually what she discovered was that she really liked herself. Right? And it was amazing. There was space for that voice to show up. Andrea learned to paddleboard, um, overcoming her fear of the ocean. This is the story I'm going to zoom in on, so it merits more detail. Bill found himself becoming manic, traveled around the UK, and his experience on the road was extremely therapeutic for him. Sam experienced extreme racism and poverty growing up, and through stand-up comedy, he found a way to turn that into something that could be spoken about, and indeed that made him powerful in an interesting way that he has then taken on further. Anyway, I'm going to talk about that too. Sophie wasn't accepted and didn't accept things growing up, went on huge cycling journeys. I'm going to talk about this. Helen's child was born with Down syndrome, which hadn't been diagnosed, and her way of processing this and working through it was to write a graphic novel about it. Rainer had trauma in his life, and engaged in a series of heart practices. Like, a lot of them were yogic practices, and integrated them in a fascinating way. There's, in all of these cases, a link between the originary wound that people are carrying and the mode of healing in the world that they found. This is what I want to talk to you about. And here's one study. I'd like to talk with you. First of all, this is Andrea. She found herself living by the seaside in the UK, but commuting every week to work in an American city, right? So she would get on the plane, she would fly to the middle of America, she would work really hard. She's someone who's extraordinarily skilled and competent and professional, right? She would work all day. Friday night, she'd hop on the plane back, go and see her husband, see her family, recharge, wash her clothes, iron her clothes, pack her clothes, and go again, right? That's how she was doing. Then she had to have back surgery. Her physio recommended that she take up paddleboarding to rehabilitate herself. Problem is, at this point, she realizes that she's terrified of the water, right? So she gets as far as the paddleboarding course and cannot go, right? Interesting. Now she remembers that there's a backstory here, which has been completely blocked out. Turns out 8 years ago, she was swimming on holiday when she got cramp and she started to sink below the surface. And she thought that she was hitting the bottom, right? Later, she found out what had happened was a turtle had swum up and held her up. Extraordinary. For long enough so that her son, who'd witnessed this, could swim from the beach and swim down and pull her up and save her, right? 8 years later, completely blocked this out through busyness. She hadn't really even realized she was scared of the ocean. So what happened then? A very patient paddleboard instructor who was very kind and who totally got it, right, spent months with her, taking her out a tiny bit further each time, right? And this is like the kind of care that I hope I can deliver as a therapist. Actually, let's never forget that, like, just because we call ourselves therapists, we're not the only therapists. Here is an amazing person, a paddleboard instructor. After months, Andrea managed to paddle across open water. Incredible thing happened, right? Her relationship with her fear of the water changed. And she was very precise about this. Like, she didn't stop being scared. This is really important. It's just she was able to be with the fear in a different way. She was able to name it and feel the parameters of it. And she realized that her fear never announced itself as fear. She had no idea that she was someone who was fearful, right? It was just busyness. She was just keeping herself busy. This was interesting. She realized that unannounced fears have shaped her life, right? It turns out there's more of a backstory to the backstory. Here it comes. She remembered that she'd moved to the UK seaside because she loves the sea. Aha! Yeah, it was her idea to move there. She wasn't born there. She was born in London, like me. Um, Her relationship with her fear of not being a success changed. And she made this huge commitment, actually, to building a network in the place that she lived, like building a professional network and a friendship network and an activity network. She committed with this huge effort to inhabiting the place and the time where she was, right? And this was amazing. And now she is living and working really close to home where she lives, right? So this extraordinary therapeutic process that she discovered and built for herself, right? Who does it involve? It involves a surgeon, it involves a physio, it involves a paddleboard instructor, right? It involves her son, and it involves someone who isn't even human. There's a turtle in this sort of chain of love and care and concern. That has been part of this person's therapeutic journey. Right? So these are big journeys, and they bear witnessing, and they bear noticing, and they bear thinking about as therapists, and think, like, what's the part of this journey that we can help people to notice? What's the part of this journey that we can help them to language? Or can we help at all? Sometimes maybe we should stay out of the way. All of my participants spoke in some way or another about this feeling of being released, right? So Peter talks about this very directly. He says, remember, Peter was the person that found football crowds therapeutic, right? Football crowds and playing music with people. He said maybe these are released places that, while maybe talking about things can help, therapeutic relationship or whatever, but maybe with these, I found a place which allows the pent up emotional world to just be allowed to have its place in a different way. So from this, from all of my participants in some way or another talking about these two places, right? Their day-to-day place and their released place. This is the model that my findings and my reading of the literature pulls up, and it's something that I'm going to invite you to consider. So this isn't a model of reality, it's just something I'm inviting you to think about for this hour, right? We can imagine two spaces in our existence. We can imagine a pressurized space, a space that's about action, a space that's about doing and having to do. It's a space that's rational. It's a space that's technological. It's a space that the capitalist world loves us to stay in, actually. It's a very productive place. And time is measured in hours, seconds, minutes, days, chronos time, stopwatch time. And then all of my participants, in one way or another, talked about this released space. Released was the word that a lot of them used. Released, right? As if there's a pressure that is not there, right? And this is much more about dwelling than doing. It's about being with something and seeing how that becomes. It's more intuitive than rational. And it lives in the world of, what we can call kairos time, which is a time for things rather than a time when things happen. So in kairos time, there can be seasons. It can be time to harvest. It can be time to heal. It can be time differently. So we can imagine two spaces, but look, let's not say that there's a goodie and a baddie here, right? Let's imagine that we need both of these spaces, right? Unless we're an algorithm, right? This is really interesting. Algorithms are very, very good at being in this rational and technological and chronological space and time. Increasingly, we're encouraged to interface with these things and almost to have a form of being that synchronizes with algorithmic being. If we're an algorithm, we're probably really happy to stay in that pressurized space, but we need the other space. But if you were to spend all of your time in that other space, that really makes you a hermit. You do at some point need to get some stuff done with the other people in your life who you love and maybe have to provide for. We have like kids that we need to look after, partners who we love, we have friends, we have things that we want to buy, like shoes, so we're going to need to work. And so we're going to need both of these spaces. Both of these spaces are potentially therapeutic. Let's imagine that. But first of all, let's think about what's pressurized space like. So all of my participants talked about alienation. I felt very alone. Nobody seemed to be having quite the experience I had. In pressurized space, people were at their limit. Sophie says, I was so unhappy and struggling so much. At the weekend, I was so unhappy I couldn't do anything. The world was excruciating, right? Your relationship not being able to handle what's happening to you. I remember my mum looking at me and saying, don't ever let your father hear you say that. He'd be really hurt. What's pressurized space like? Well, there's this feeling that people have in that space of needing to heal. Raina said this beautiful thing. Probably my whole life, my heart has been praying for liberation. Or on the other hand, people didn't know that they needed something to change. Like Sophie said, before I wanted or consciously wanted to do these things, it was just a sense of hopelessness. People's moods in that pressurized space don't show up as disclosing or revealing anything. They show up as just a block. So this is Sophie saying, you wouldn't immediately recognize it as fear. It would just be a kind of very inspecific anxiety, or just being worried about everything, or being worried about small particular things. But there was also the great big stop doing this, get out of here, turn away impulse, which I recognize. Inauthenticity, right, of this pressurized space. Peter put this brilliantly. In everyday life, we're not kind of permitted the chance to just scream, sometimes just scream obscenities. There's this great fear of unproductivity. Andrea said, I never ever attempted to try to create that in my life, this other way of being, of dwelling, because I was scared I would lose work, I would lose money. It just wasn't achievable. Right? There's this enormous pressure to be in the pressurized space. What's it like? It's very gendered, actually. Like, it was really striking in my research what a big deal it is for women to put themselves even temporarily first, right? So a lot of the men in my study wouldn't didn't think it was such a big deal to take some time for themselves. Whereas a lot of the women in the study, it was a really big deal. I don't know if you remember one of my participants who had, it was an enormous deal for her just to take 2 days off after 6 years of being a parent. So Helen here says, I've got 4 kids and they were all at home at that time. So I got up at 5 every morning and I'd work before everyone was up for 2 hours. And then I'd work later on in the day. But then I'd have to, after school stuff, picking them up and things like that. So for her, she's talking about her healing here. So I really made time for it, in a way that was really disciplined and tough, So what's depressurization like? What's it like going into this other space? Really spooky for people, right? Is the first answer. Not a joyful and instantly liberating thing, right? So when you go into this other space that they described, this is Bill, who went on a pilgrimage around the UK. He said, I'd gone from being really excited about the trip to thinking, I'm in a pretty tricky situation here, like out on his own on the road, feeling a bit manic. Or his Sophie, who went on these enormous cycling journeys. There's a sort of grey area of thinking that something's completely impossible, she said. And yet, paradoxically, at the same time, kind of thinking I could probably do it if I tried. And that is terrifying. Or Rhiannon, who said, I did go into it thinking this is either going to drive me completely insane and I'm going to be in some kind of institution at the end of it, or it's going to be really, really enlightening. This is her talking about going into silence for a weekend. So this ambivalence, noticing moments and being in them. This is Helen talking about her daughter, like drawing the pictures of her. I really took care to, it was like it gave me a moment to really appreciate how gorgeous she was. It's the only point in the interview where she cried. Revenge. Oh, revenge. It's so underrated, right? In this released place, revenge is a big thing, right? There isn't much of a place for it in our world. There's a huge pleasure in avenging, she says, in taking my revenge. Or Sam, who had this very horrific racist bullying when he was a kid, and horrific experiences of poverty, said that one of the most powerful things I managed to do was to turn being bullied into doing something powerful with it. What else is this released space like? Raina says there's this deep awareness that this isn't all there is, that there is something else. And then these amazing attunements to things. Like Bill had this moment where he listened to a choir, quite by accident. There was a choir practicing in a cathedral that he just wandered into. He said the acoustics were just perfect. And it's just something the singers do every day. It's an everyday occurrence. But for me, it's like this huge, uplifting, almost religious experience. You have time to notice moments in this space. Being with others in a new way. This is a nice one from Raina. The very first time I met her, she offered me a hug and I couldn't move afterwards. And she laughed. And I thought, oh, this is normal for you. No, it's not for me. Or Sam and his experience of doing stand-up comedy. He says, I got laughs and I felt a love that I didn't have for myself from these strangers in a room. And it slowly kind of reforms me. Creating people's own space to heal was a big deal. Sophie was huge on this. I spent an entire year researching and buying kit, building a bike, creating a website, trying to plan a route, working on all the admin, doing research. Right? These aren't sort of enlightenment experiences that people just necessarily stumble into. What's really interesting is you need the pressurized space and that rational way of being to consciously create the space that you can heal in. This was a theme again and again of people's therapeutic experiences that they had built for themselves, is that they were an effort, right? They weren't something that just happened. You have to know, you have to work on it like everything else. What else is depressurization like? Really weird, right? People notice the unhomeliness of it. This is Rhiannon talking about the first hours at her silent retreat. It was really weird for me to exist in that silence. I think for the first day and a half, I was kind of looking around going, am I doing this right? Should I be making eye contact with people? Should I be communicating with my body? No, it's a strange sense of unsettlement. I'm going to skip through this a little bit, but oh yeah, this is a really interesting part. In this released place, people's invisible way of being became visible. This is Andrea. Remember Andrea who learned to paddleboard? What I hadn't realized, and it's only taken me the last year and a half, believe it or not, to realize this, was that that incident of drowning, I'd been holding it back and holding it back. I never went back in the water for 8 years, but it had made me hold back on so much more in my life. This is what people notice in that space. The way they were being suddenly becomes visible to them. Okay, this is my second big finding from the study. Is that there are certain modes of being in the world that invite movement between those two spaces, that pressurized space and that release space, right? These were the modes that my participants experienced. The first one was being in transit. So this is like when Bill goes on a pilgrimage, there's something about constant movement that invites you to change between the pressurized place and the release place, that frees up your way of being. Being in nature was enormous. Like for nearly everyone, there was an intersection of being in that natural world. And I don't necessarily mean being in proximity to greenness and blueness. Right? You can measure these things. There are amazing instruments that talk about proximity to nature. And if you reduce nature to, wild space, then yeah, sure. But actually, there's a way that my participants describe being in nature as not being on technology's clock, not being on capitalism's clock so much, being in nature as an engagement with the whole of the way things are in their own terms. Being in alterity, by which I just mean dreaming, being in altered states through hypnosis, through trance, through drugs, be that prescription or recreational or experimental or plant medicine or whatever. Being in the body, like these big embodied practices, like so paddleboarding would be a really good example. But so also would be being part of a football crowd, right? So also would be moving through travel, right? So there's a lot of crossover between these modes. And finally, being witness. So something I really noticed is everybody had talked about how do other people heal? What have I seen other people doing? How have I noticed other people recovering from trauma, for example? And how do I bear witness to what's happened to me? Like, without exception, all 8 of my participants, and this is not something that I had been looking for, but all 8 of them had spoken about it in public, had written about it, had drawn about it, had made YouTube films about it, had done something about it to pay this thing forward, right? So they bore witness and they were witness, and that was part of their integration of this experience. This is how I came back to ancient Greece, right? I didn't start with ancient Greece. I noticed that all of these modes were actually the modes that had been practiced in the Asclepia, in these ancient Greek healing centers, right? For a start, you had to go to these places, right? They didn't exist in the center of town in ancient Greece. You'd have to walk to Epidaurus. Even now, you have to take a car from Athens, take you an hour and 40 minutes, right? But back in the day, that was a pilgrimage, right? Then you would be in nature. Right? These places were all created in beautiful places on hillsides, often with a view of water. There was always running water there. It was a big part of the ritual. They were deliberately beautiful places far from the city. Being in alterity was what happened on day 1, right? So you would go and you would sleep in these communal dormitories called avatons, and sleep would be induced. They had these tinctures of wine and opiates. So if you didn't dream, they were jolly well going to make you, right? And then in the morning, you would talk about those dreams, and those dreams would be interpreted. And because dreams back in the day weren't thought to be intrinsic, they were thought to come from the gods or from nature or from other. So they were worthy of interpretation and thinking about. And being in the body, there was a they would do sport, they would do fitness, they would walk around, they would dance, they would sing. There was a lot of communal embodied practice in the Asclepia. And finally, this mode of being witness was huge. There were libraries in all of these Asclepia. There were scrolls that people would read. You can go there now and you can see all of these scroll holes in the libraries there. People were invited to read experiences of other people who'd found something healing. Right? So you would read each other's experiences. These are some of the earliest, what we might call bibliotherapies. So these modes of being in the world that my participants reported today as helping them to move between pressurized space and released space, these are the exact same modes, give or take, that were practiced BC, in ancient Greece. And this is something that when this started to come out, made me feel very small and made me think this is really interesting, this modern thing that we call talking therapy, which we, as practitioners, we know how powerful it is. We know how important it is. We've seen it in our lives and the lives of other people, that it matters, that it means something. But how humbling to find that it's held in this much bigger context of people's own big therapeutic journeys. Right? What does that mean for us as therapists? How do we notice these journeys that people are making? Third finding, moving between the spaces and not getting stuck in either of them is therapeutic for people. It's a two-way street between these things. You can't go off on pilgrimage forever. There's a coming home at some point. And it turns out the Greeks were really good at knowing this as well. They had a lot of stories about how difficult it is to come home, how effortful that process is. Okay, fourth finding, really interesting. It's an effort to come home from this release space. It's an effort to integrate these therapeutic and revelatory experiences that you've had in that release space, in that intuitive space, back into the world, right? That we know, back into the world where you have pressure, right? Where you have a budget, where you might be finding it really hard to make the rent, right? Where you have care responsibilities, where people need things, where it's hard. So how do people do it? Well, 4 ways that I found, and there are probably so many more. I found at least 4 in all of the participants that I spoke with. They're through language, through pragmatic change, through creative processes, and through relating to people in new ways. This is how people brought it home. I'll talk a little bit about that now. So bringing it back through language, one of the big things people did was they started to name the thing that couldn't be named before. This is a really powerful thing from Helen, talking about her child. She said, I feel so guilty. I walk into her bedroom in the morning and I hope she's died of cot death. That's quite fucking heavy. I have myself saying, I felt like murdering her. And I have myself saying, you felt like it, but you didn't do it. I looked after her and I loved her. And even when I didn't love her, I breastfed her, I cared for her. But I felt very angry with her as well. So people name the thing. By naming it, they can bring it back into their life. Okay, people do a lot of theorizing. This is a linguistic practice. Here's Peter saying, maybe football stimulates the emotions of highs and lows and joy and anger, maybe stimulating bits of me that are understimulated, perhaps because of my kind of neurological makeup. This is a theory. This is a language thing that people can do to make sense of what's happening with them. Rainer says, our idea of something isn't the something. Our representation of ourselves isn't ourselves. Our identity isn't who we are. It's a story, So this linguistic route. Then there's a really pragmatic way that people bring that experience back into their life. Peter says, well, I think that might be something that I now recognize, so that I know that I can go to this place to help me, right? They know that they can do that thing again. Rhiannon, this is the person who went on the silent retreat, says, well, I think it would be meaningful again. I'd be interested to repeat it, but probably after a little time, I think silence in general is quite beneficial. The other thing that people do pragmatically is they decide consciously that they won't reapply that therapeutic experience. This is something I really loved from Bill. He'd found going to a particular show while he was out on his travels really moving and therapeutic. He says, I remember seeing a Willem de Kooning show at Tate Britain. I'd never seen anything like it. And it's funny, though, because I walked through and I loved it so much, I walked back through the exhibition. But the way back, it didn't strike me as much on the way back, because going through the first time, it was like, bloody hell, I've never seen anything like this before. And then all the way back, I had seen it before. It's really neat, right? He's decided that there are certain things that aren't going to work again, right? And it was very important. And that's the thing about pilgrimage, right? It really isn't the everyday. What else do people do pragmatically? They integrate the authenticity that they found out there as an everyday good. So I'm going to talk about this experience that Andrea had, actually. This is the person who was working right across the other side of the world, being extremely successful. And then she comes back. She asks herself, well, why was I sitting in boardrooms justifying my existence to executives and directors on the other side of the world? Good God, what was going on there? Right? It's now unimaginable to her that she could be in that place again. Or Rhiannon, I'm talking about taking time for herself. She says, oh, it just makes me a bit calmer, more effective, a more honest person as well. Like I'm not burying anything, I'm feeling everything, which is, much better. It's a pragmatic everyday. Renegotiating a relationship. This is a very practical exercise, with my time and my space. Rhiannon again, like before I would have felt that was selfish, or I wouldn't have even asked for that time. I would never have said to my husband, I need an hour, you need to step in here. Right? It's a very pragmatic way of bringing it back into life. Okay, third big mode was creative. Every single one of my participants, I was really surprised by this, had taken up some form of creative endeavor in order to integrate this therapeutic experience into their life. Part of it was letting the creative format hold something that they had been holding on their own before. Right? So, for example, when Helen put something into a graphic novel, she realized that it didn't have the power to hurt her anymore, right? Once she had created something with it. Or Sophie here wrote about her experience of cycling. I choose the words with which I share it, and the media through which I share it, and the people who do and don't get to hear about it. That's just telling the story of what happened, what I learned from it, and how I processed it. People use creative processes to understand what's happened to them. Like this is a good one from Bill. After he's come back from his pilgrimage, I wrote a blog about it, which when I was manic was just like tons of stuff. And then I came back to it about a year later and I edited it right down. And I was reading, it was good, the edited version. I would like to think retains some of the energy, but it is a bit more structured. And this is really interesting, actually, because there's this live experience people have, and they edit it back into their lives and this back into this rational space, so that the therapeutic thing exists in a new and creative way that works in the world that people have to live in. I'm going to skip forward a bit here. Yeah, to connect with others in a new way. There's another way that people use this creative space. Peter was great here. I ended up writing an article about my experiences. I wanted other people who were in my situation to know that they weren't alone in that kind of trauma. It was so moving how many, well, all of my participants had done something like this. It was like, I've found this, I have to share it with you. And finally, relationally bringing it back into their lives, being with others in this new way that they've discovered. Sam is good here. Right now, I'm kind of like being who I am, away from the laughter. Right, that's away from his work in the comedy clubs, and not needing the laughter anymore to be who I am, and letting stuff come out which doesn't have a punchline setup. Sophie, I really like this actually. Sophie, having cycled further than I could possibly imagine riding over months and months and months. I have this real appreciation for humanity when I get back to it. And she said that with such, I think sometimes the way people say something really moves you when you hear them say it. Oh yeah, and modeling that new way of being for others. I love this from Rhiannon. One of the things that you do as an act of love is to take yourself away and model attending to your own silence, right? So realizing that the thing you've discovered in your own therapeutic process is worth something, it's worth living it, and it's worth other people witnessing it. So this was the fourth big finding, right? That people can every day these experiences in at least 4 ways, and I'm sure that all of you will know other ways that you do this, that other people do it. And these were the 4 that I really noticed. And as a therapist, I noticed one really interesting thing, which was this linguistic process of bringing things back into the pressurized space and talking about the importance of the stuff that happens in the release space and why we can take it seriously is a big part of the work of therapy, talking therapy. And so I was really interested in the speaking component of how people bring these quite transcendental experiences back into their lives. And when we get into the questions, I'm going to be really interested in those people who are therapists or have a connection with therapy or think about therapy. I'd be really interested in where you think that part of being a therapist connects with these whole life experiences that people have had. This is my 5th and last finding. I think this is my last slide, actually. So we're right on the hour. I'm pleased with that. And thank you all for your patience. I really want to share this 5th and last finding with you because I think it's the most important thing that people do. And I find it very moving. Here are all these 8 people. Peter, who found football crowds therapeutic. Rhiannon, who found silence important for her. Andrea, who learned to paddleboard because she discovered she was scared of the sea. Bill, who went around the UK. Sam, who did stand-up comedy. Sophie, who cycled on these epic journeys. Helen, who made a graphic novel about her experience. And Raina, who met people, teachers, gurus, coaches, and worked with them, worked through things. I started to think, well, who's holding that space for them while they do this, right? Who is holding that space? And so for Peter, like, it was a whole crowd, like 60,000 people would hold that space for him, right? And as he held it for them. right? And later when he was playing music, it was the other three people in a string quartet were holding that space for him. And it feels that they were playing music, but there was another journey going on as well there. Okay. So for Rhiannon, it was all the other people who were at that silent retreat. Everyone else who agreed not to speak. Everyone else who agreed to respect her silence and her need for it. Right? Strangers. For Andrea, who held that therapeutic space for her? Well, it was a paddleboard instructor. It wasn't, me as a therapist. It was someone who knew how to help her at that point in her life. And when you think about who else held that space, her son held it, a physiotherapist held it, a surgeon held that space, a turtle held that space for a little while. Right? There's this chain of love and care and concern that holds a space for people to heal in. When Bill had this transcendental experience with music, there was a choir who held that space for him. An audience held it for Sam. This is something that I found really moving about Sophie's story. I was thinking, like, who holds the space for someone who's cycling across a continent, right, on back roads over months on their own? I don't know, so many people, but really car drivers, everyone who drove around her rather than through her at night when it was raining, right? Everyone who took care to slow down and go around her, even if they didn't know they were holding someone in their therapeutic journey, right? These are the acts of care and compassion that we show for each other on a day-to-day basis without hardly knowing we're doing it. And they matter, right? We're holding a space for each other to heal in. For Helen, when she wrote a graphic novel needs readers. When we're witnessing people's experience, we're holding them. And Raina, this is my favorite journey actually, because it's so complex and involves so many people. One person at a time held that space for him. As simple as that, one person at a time. And sometimes we are that person for someone, I guess, even though we're not always aware of it. We're not always aware that we're holding a little piece of someone's own therapeutic journey. So that's it from me. That's what I found out. I found 5 things out in my little study, right? So it's a little study, and I'm really curious to know, what you think about it and what it brings up for you. The things I found, we can imagine these 2 spaces in our existence that are pressurized and released. There are certain modes of being in the world that really seem to invite movement between those spaces. Being in transit, being in nature, being in altered states, being embodied, and witnessing and being witnessed. And it turns out that my participants here in 2023 reported these modes of being in the world. And so did the ancients. And that's really interesting. Moving between those 2 spaces and not getting stuck in either of them is therapeutic. How do you not get stuck in either of them? You effortfully create ways to move between the pressurized and the released places in your life. 4 of them that I noticed were there was a linguistic mode, a pragmatic mode, a very creative mode, and a relating mode. And the 5th and last thing that I noticed, and you might notice different things, but I noticed that we're all holding space for each other all the time. We're always holding space for people's journeys. That's it from me. Thank you very much. I'm really honored by your huge patience and your attention. I hope that was interesting for you. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. Oh, it's great. I can see you all again. I couldn't see anyone while that was happening. I'm quite relieved to see that you're all still there. So thanks. And I think we have half an hour now for questions, and I'd be absolutely delighted to hear them. Or questions or comments, right? It doesn't have to be a question.
I'm going to jump in before the questions come, and I see we've already got some in the chat just to say thank you so much, Chris. I know you said that it's a little study, and I understand why you said that, but there are some really, really big messages. And as always, I love to take notes. I'm quite well known for my avid note taking, and as you were speaking, I was like, oh gosh, I wish I need to go back, and I realized that actually we can all go back. It's going to be recorded. I will be going and recording and watching it again. But honestly, there is so much. And thank you so much. So questions, as Chris said, it's not just a little, why not? But it's really important. It really means a lot to him, as he said. So please do jump in with these questions. There are quite a lot of us, so I think possibly popping them in the chat can be helpful, or raising our hand, and then nice, it goes straight to the screen. So Alina, I see your hand, but I'm just going to do a sort of first come first serve, and I noticed that really early on we had a question from Joanne Taylor. So Joanne, if you're still there, would you like to ask this question, or would you like me to read it out? Joanne.
I'm happy to speak to Chris.
Hi, Joanne.
Hi there. Yeah, my question is, if someone has been seeing a therapist for quite a while, and they've explored the person's childhood and their family life experiences and everything, and so the person has quite a lot of insight, but they're still remaining quite stuck where they are, and they know that some healing still needs to take place, but they don't feel as if they've really got to the core wound exactly. And so I guess it's hard to know, but how would someone go about finding what kind of therapeutic mode might be able to help them start discovering or facing what their wound is?
I love the question. Thank you, Joanne. I think that's a really, really good question, and one that I think about a lot. I like the way you put it about the stuckness. I think I'd start by thinking that the stuckness is really interesting. Like what's inside that feeling of being stuck. And by staying with that, like see what comes from it, because often there's often, in fact, I'm not going to say, I'm just going to talk about one of my participants, and this was Bill, who ended up going on this pilgrimage, right? So he'd been finding himself really stuck in his life, and the stuckness was showing up as sometimes being really, what he called really depressed, and sometimes what he called being really manic, right? So he was like in one place all the time, sometimes feeling very much this and sometimes feeling very much that, right? And so his stuckness was showing up really energetically like that. And in the end for him, it was just about taking that stuckness seriously and giving himself permission to do a thing that he almost hadn't dared to do, which was just to cut loose from all of his responsibilities and go on this thing, right? So for him, it was like by really noticing the nature of that stuckness and how it was showing up, that showed him what the energy was that he needed to take seriously and needed to, I don't know, give expression to. I don't know if this is helping. I don't know what other people think, but to think that there's a sort of wisdom in the stuckness itself, right? That doesn't necessarily have one answer, but has within itself like a kind of energy that needs answering. Right? Sorry, I feel that that's quite an abstract answer, and if anyone else can do better, I'd really like to hear it. Yes, it would help me too. I really like the question, Joanne. Jenny, I think you're talking, but I think you're muted.
Yes, can you hear me now?
I can, yeah, thanks.
Okay. So, in looking at the stuckness, one of the things that I think that I have found in myself and in other clients is that bringing the stuckness out is more about moving non-conscious memories from the body into the conscious mind. So through mind body somatic kinds of movements, it becomes possible to unstick some of that energy, and without even knowing where it comes from or why it comes from, it comes. It's okay. Just to be explicit, I was in an automobile accident where I was knocked unconscious. I had many years later. They had the doctors had basically given up on me. She's either going to be dead or a vegetable. I'm now a psychotherapist, and so of course none of that happened. But in the process, when I started my own business, I kept feeling a stuckness there that was keeping me from really building a business. And so I started going to somatic exploration kinds of exercises where they were using tantra, body imagery, body movement, somatic kinds of things to help people unstick those emotional knots that they don't really get. And so in the process of doing that, there was a body movement we were doing with a breathing technique that we were doing. And in the process of doing that, my body released the emotional experience of the accident. So in that experience, I physiologically released the fear, the pain. I don't remember there being pain. I just remember there being fear, there being noise, confusion, and body movement as the car spun. It spun several times. And there was no vision, there was no hearing, there was only the brain picture of this emotional experience and the fear coming up around it. And after that, my business did a lot better.
Jenny, thank you very much for sharing that. And the energy in what you just said is huge. And that brings up a curiosity for me as well about like how did you bring that revelation back into your day to day?
There was not a conscious way of bringing it back in. It just took less energy to do the things I needed to do. Yeah, that was the main thing.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Elena, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, well, good that it's virtual hand, so it doesn't take a lot of effort to keep it up. But first, I wanted to say thank you. I found the research very interesting, and I think that even though it's a small group, I think it would be quite accurate representation if you extrapolate it. I feel like what these people going through can resonate with a lot of people. So I think I have like 2 points which really caught my attention. First, I think we already have this wisdom, which is generational wisdom, but probably it was a bit lost. And when you look, all the like current research is new, they're always based on something that already been done some time ago, long time ago. People already have been doing it. It's just like at some point we stopped doing it, and now we like try to get, I'm just sometimes a bit laughing what's now this biohacking things like grounding and earthing. I've done it at my grandma's village, okay, my whole childhood. And now people is like, yeah, if you go with like bare feet, that's really grounding and stuff. But people have been doing it for like forever. This is first thing. And second thing, I wanted to say that I think very often in life, we wait till all those traumas and negative experiences accumulate till the point where you do need like a serious intervention, like even if it's your own therapeutic journey, it is like a silence retreat, or like, I don't know, 1 year I'm going without work or something like this, or I don't know, cancer happens or something else happens. So there's always some kind of trigger that pushes us into this space. Okay, like now I don't have any more capacity, like I need to go there. So I'm just wondering, how can, or like maybe do you see any way to take your research and see how we can implement it in little doses while the catastrophe didn't happen yet?
Mm.
But how can we maybe do it in a small batches and then kind of reproduce it from one space to another space to integrate it like healthy?
Oh, wonderful. Like wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for what is a question and an inspiration, actually. So but first I want to acknowledge the other thing that you said about like ancestral practices, which is so big and so interesting, because like I go back to this one particular tradition that I've noticed has a resonance with what these people who are my participants are telling me. So I grew up like reading stories about like Greek gods and monsters, right? And when I was a kid, and so I go back to that place. But there are 100 different cultural traditions that you could go to instead to say like exactly what you've been saying. Like, where I'm from, like grounding is a thing. It's not something that was just invented. This is brilliant, and it's so interesting, and it has made me think, like, wouldn't that be interesting if, as therapists, we talk more about the tradition that we're practicing in through our families, through our ancestors, through like where do I sit? Am I practicing an approach, or am I just carrying on like this idea of being, I don't know, whoever it is on the last house in town, who does this kind of stuff, right? So interesting. And to your second point, and thank you so much for that too, about like how can we look at these modes of being in the world? How can we look at the need to take our own feelings, right, of, like Joanne was saying, of stuckness seriously, like to find out what those feelings need, to notice that our emergency is an emergency and is valid, right, before we get to this point where we're smashed up by our own emergency. Like, that's a really interesting question. Why I got really interested in this kind of research was because therapy is expensive and elitist, right? So this is a real problem, right? Like we're trained to do this thing that is very expensive to deliver. Like even if like you end up in the most altruistic place you can, and you see lots of people on reduced rates and for free, right? It's still a really expensive thing to do, to be one human being in a room with another human being. And that's what got me into this idea of, can we, by really listening to people talking about how they're healing, by really taking their stories of personal healing seriously, by trying to find the themes in those stories, by trying to really make visible, yeah, this has worked for these people, and this might be why, right? And there'll be lots of reasons if this might be why. But if we can normalize and popularize this idea of the basic wisdom that people have, and we as therapists who are very, very trained to notice things can really use that noticing and publicly notice, right, these things that people are doing in private, I think it can give people more confidence that they can take themselves seriously, right? That they can notice that sometimes it's the lives that we're all being called on to lead now, that put us so hard into that pressurized space, and have less and less time for that intuitive space. If people can notice that that is the thing that is happening to us all collectively, and that here are some of the things that other people have done to get themselves at least a toehold in the intuitive space, in the released space, I think that can start to become part of the discussion about therapy in the world, right? Because at the moment, when I hear what the language of therapy is in the world outside therapy, it's still like there's a lot of like very diagnostic language being used, a lot of very theoretical language being used, a lot of constructs and ideas that like that things are syndromes and particular disorders, and that you need a particular specialist angle to look at them from. And sometimes that is true, right? But there are also these other ways of being with human distress, that nobody owns, and that are, well, as you said, Elena, ancestral rather than specialist. And I think if we can normalize that and notice it and celebrate it, rather than doing this thing that my participant Raina talked about of trying to hold on to it and say this is our special secret knowledge and no one else must have it, then we help to promote a culture where people go into this released and intuitive place before it's an emergency. Oh, Elena, I think you're muted. Sorry.
I was just now thinking that maybe it's then the angle of how you share this message, because I can assume that this paddling experience that worked for Sophie might not work for somebody else in the same way, right? And might not be therapeutic at all. It might be just a hobby. So it was like really a combination of specific trauma that she had, which matched with this activity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess in this sharing, it's important that it's not like one to copy recipe.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That the message is not if you're scared of the water, you must learn to paddleboard. You know, you must face your fears, which is a very sort of like rational way to look at it. And you know, it's the way that often we're trained to deal with phobias by exposure therapy or something, and it's like, and that's very much not the message that I'm hearing from Andrea's story. I'm hearing just something that was new to me, which is like, gosh, fear can show up as busyness, right? Fear can show up as not having time, right? You don't need to know that you're afraid to be suffering from fear, right? That was the learning for me from like really listening to Andrea, and those are the things that I think are interesting to say. Just to say, look, we found this. We found that fear can show up as busyness. Wow, I didn't know. And those are the things that we pick up on by noticing other people's like therapeutic journeys outside therapy. Not that there's a specific recipe for each ailment, but that our emotions can show up in complex ways in this complex world we've created.
Can I say something?
Yes, Sally, go for it.
I was just wondering, because some of the questions actually resonate with our need to pressurize, to use your word, Chris, and accelerate and therapize and heal our clients, and to do it quickly. So let's find out what helped these people, and then we can merchandise it in a nice, neat box and sell it to the masses. I wish we could, but on the other hand, wouldn't be like learning from this is the humbling. Someone said here how much you're humble, Chris, and I think this is actually what a great choice for you for research to humble our profession as therapists and say we're not that important, because real healing is actually being done by those people, or by when we heal ourselves as well, right? We are those people as well. But people heal themselves when it's the right time. They find the way, and this is the healing part, that they find the way. So if I would go to a client and to your participant and say, why don't you go to a silent retreat? That will do good to you. Maybe it won't have the same effect.
Yeah, thanks, Tully. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's and I suppose as therapists though, I now because I'm so into this stuff, I'm so into this sort of outside therapy, I have to really start checking myself, right? To stay in that place where I'm with someone, I'm helping them to notice their stuff and not bringing in my sort of whole world outside therapy thing. So it becomes really interesting for me, like saying every time I think I might try suggesting a silent retreat to someone, what's just happened in me, right? And I've all I can say is that I've really noticed that I've become a different therapist through really focusing on people's own journeys and other people's journeys. It hasn't made me a therapist that has started to suggest some of these extracurricular activities, but it's made me a therapist who notices like my desire to do that, and wonder where that comes from with me, and wonder what it's showing up for them, I guess. But where I think that this work really is, in terms of like noticing people's own ways of healing, is really for all of us as therapists in society, right? Outside the therapy room, in this other part of our job we do, where we create a space within which we can hold a space for clients, right? I think there's this really big work to be done in the wider society of creating this culture that is therapeutic, of saying, look, let's notice how we all hold a therapeutic space for each other while people do these processes that only they can know is the right thing for them, right? And so let's just try and, I don't know, like live with love and care for each other, and be really careful to drive around people rather than too close while they're healing, and I think that for me is something that we can all be saying as therapists. Like we can be really normalizing this idea that we are all each other's therapists all the time. That's where I feel that this stuff really wants to go, because people are interested in therapy and they're interested in what therapists think, and so I think what we say about it in public really matters.
Thank you so much for the questions, and thank you so much for the responses, Chris. I've got my eye on the time. We have some more questions. We have some more points. I saw something that Sarah had written actually, and I thought it might be nice if Sarah wanted to bring that and say that to you as well. But I see Alina also did. But also, it's up to you, Chris. Do you have we're at a few minutes to go. So how do you feel?
Shall we do one more question? Because I'm conscious that we said it would finish at 8:30, and people might have stuff that they're trying to get to, and so I'd be happy to answer questions forever. And as you will all have noticed about me, I can go on a bit, so I need to turn that down a bit. So if I do one more question, and then if anyone else has questions or things they want to say to me, drop me a line, and I will definitely talk and answer and all of that stuff outside the forum. Is that good? Okay. And so yeah, there was this question that you mentioned.
Was that me, Natalie, that you were inviting there?
I was, yes.
Thank you.
Hi,
Chris,
Sarah.
hi, Chris, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely wonderful, rich session with you, so thank you. And I've really been thinking, I think you invited those of us who are therapists to wonder about these two realms of the pressurized space and the release space. And I was really thinking about my own work as a therapist and how I move between those two spaces. And even my deeply meaningful work that I love as a therapist, seeing my clients, can end up feeling like a pressurized space. And I've really been thinking a lot about how I use that space away from my clients, and just really considering things like how many clients I allow myself to see, and the space that I give myself, and the danger of that economic pressure to try and see more clients, do the most work that you can, but how counterproductive that is if I'm not also having that release space, because I am my own resource, and I need to have those other activities which aren't in my own echo chamber of being a therapist and reading therapy books and doing CPD. And I wondered whether the importance of that also is to model that with our clients, to actually share the fact that that's what I do to take care of myself and to be a rounded, healthier person. It's not just about what we do in the therapy room when we're both sitting together, but what we do outside, and how I take care of myself can also inform the healing of my clients. So yeah, I think you've really highlighted some really important points, which I've really valued hearing.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I can't say it better than you just said it. It's interesting, isn't it? Like how, because we're often, or some of us are trained not to, I guess, to keep our cards a bit close to our chest as therapists, and not to disclose much, and not to show that that part of me. Like this is how I am out in the world, and that's what holds me. This is the space that holds me. And what you're saying about how actually it's really important sometimes to say, okay, well, this is how someone is held in the world, and notices themselves being held in the world, and needs to be held in the world in these ways, as well as talking about it.
Yeah,
it's a really important way of modeling, and so I'm curious alongside you about what does that mean for the practice of therapy. It was brilliant. Thank you for saying it.
We have met the end of our time together tonight, but thank you all for listening so caringly, for really letting yourself be captivated by Chris and by each other, and for really being present, tonight. I can feel that. I can hear that in the questions and in the comments, and it's just so generous of you to take the time as an audience, and of course Chris, to take the time and effort to share what you've been exploring all of this time. I know you're creeping towards the end, and there will be that whole new depressured space for you to find weird, and for you to have to learn to live with when your thesis is submitted, and that next chapter. But I did notice, and I don't know if you managed to see this comment, but somebody wrote, I wish that Chris would write a whole book all about all of this that he's discovering, so that I can absorb it more slowly and more deeply. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but not so much. And I have a sense that what with Chris and his writing, that this might be a possibility. So if that's happening, then we will hopefully be able to let you know, and it obviously in the future, and you'll be able to do just that. But we will also have the recording of this, so please feel free to go and take that extra time to just be with everything that Chris shared. And for now, everybody, I know I keep saying it, but I really mean it. Thank you so much for being here, and hopefully we'll see you next month for Yannick Jacobs' exciting little live event as well. But in the meantime, wishing everybody so much love, a wonderful evening. I think people who are coming from the Southern Hemisphere and Australasia as well, so a very happy morning to you as well. So yes, with that, thank you so much to everyone, and good night and good morning and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Take care of yourselves. Bye.
Bye.